Welcome back. You're watching Newsx with me, Malvika. We of course track the biggest story currently, which is the release of the preliminary report of the investigation into the Air India Dreamliner crash in Ahmedabad on June 12th. One of the key findings, of course, of the preliminary report confirms that both engines of the plane had shut down mid-air within seconds of takeoff. The report by the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau into the crash of the Boeing Dreamliner 7878, in which at least 275 people in fact were killed, including 241 of the 242 passengers on board, said that the fuel cutoff switches which control the flow of fuel to the engines transitioned from a run to cut off position one after another within 1 second of each other. Now, crucially, in the cockpit voice recording, one pilot in fact can be heard asking, "Why did you cut off?" to the other, to which he replies, "I did not do so." Now, the fact that the switches transition to cut off, starving the engines of fuel, is expected to be the key focus area of the investigation going forward. The report, released after 1 a.m. on Saturday, notes that as seen in footage of the crash, the ram air turbine, which is the RAT, was deployed, indicating a total loss of power and thrust in the aircraft. Data from the Enhanced Airborne Flight Recorder, which is the EAFR, commonly known as the black box, revealed that both switches were moved back to the run position, and while engine 1 showed signs of recovery thereafter, engine 2 could not do so. The aircraft was airborne only for 32 seconds, and the report notes that it travelled only 0.9 nautical miles before crashing into the BJ Medical College hostel, which was close to the airport. The crash occurred at 1:39 p.m. The report said that while the thrust levers were found near the idle position, data from the black box reveals that they were in fact in the forward position until the impact. Both fuel control switches were also in the run position, which is of course during the impact. So, another crucial observation made by the AAIB is that there is no immediate evidence of sabotage. The investigating body has also noted that the Federal Aviation Authority had issued an advisory as far back as 2018 about the fuel control switches. So, now let us take a look at the key takeaways of the report that has just been released. We take a closer look at the preliminary investigation report released by the AAIB. So, here the first thing that we see is that engine 1 and 2 fuel cutoff switches transition from run to cutoff immediately after takeoff. So, this is of course the biggest finding in the preliminary report. Now, after this, the second takeaway we see is that pilot 1 asked pilot 2 why he cut off, to which the second pilot replies that he did not do so. So, of course, the conversation between the pilots also suggests that this was not something done manually, and the fuel switches are transitioned by themselves. So, now the third takeaway is that the ram air turbine deployed automatically to provide emergency hydraulic power. So, once the fuel supply to the engines was cut off, the RAD system did deploy automatically in order to provide a further power. So, now we see that the pilot tried to restart engine, only one engine partially recovered. So, after this system was deployed, the pilots did try to restart the engines, but only one of the engines could recover. Now, the next takeaway that we see is that the thrust levers were found at idle position, but the black box shows that takeoff thrust was engaged, suggesting failure. So, as we also just saw that the thrust levers were at idle position after the crash, so which suggests a failure, but they were deployed during the flight. The next thing that we look at, of course, is that the flap handle assembly was consistent with a normal takeoff flap setting. So, there were no issues here either. It was consistent with takeoff situations. The next thing we see is also that the fuel tested clean and there was no contamination from refueling sources. So, there were no issues, no contamination issues with the fuel either. The next thing we look at is that no recommended actions to the Boeing 787-8 aircraft and the GE engine operation. So, no the preliminary investigation has not recommended any actions against either the aircraft or the engine operators. The next thing that we see, of course, is that the left engine was installed on May 1 and the right engine was installed on March 26th. Now, what is important to remember, of course, is that the crash occurred on June 12th. So, both the engines were installed shortly before the tragic incident. The last point that we now take a look at is that the next major check of the aircraft was due on December 2025. So, this is another big takeaway, that the next major check of the aircraft was in December of this year. So, that is when the next check was scheduled.